Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society and the Society's Historical Group. It's my pleasure this evening to hand over to Gilly Reid, the RPS Historical Group Chair, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Gilly, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and hello, John, and welcome to our thing this evening. I'm looking forward to your talk, so I'll just give a little bit about John. John is an interesting and knowledgeable man. I met him when the historical group made a visit to the Bradford Industrial Museum, where he gave us a conducted tour of the building and the collections. Recently retired, John worked as a teacher in several Bradford schools for 20 years before retraining in graphic design in the early 2000s. He first became linked with the Bradford Museum and Photo Archive around the same time, initially working as a volunteer. Several freelance and limited terms of contract followed until in 2018 he gained the position of Photo Archive Assistant, having the day-to-day responsibility for all its running. He is a keen sports photographer, specialising in rugby union. His work has been published in several magazines, including the Rugby Journal. In 2020, two of his images were highly commended in the World Sports Photography Awards. His enthusiasm and knowledge of the photographs in the archive is very great, and tonight he will speak about one part of the collection. Local people asked to take photographs of Bradford and its people, led by a photographer called Tim Smith. They produced a fascinating set of photographs at a time of change in Bradford and its new mix of people, many of whom came from Asia, some to work in the mills, such as the one where the museum is situated. The quality of the photography is very high, and Tim Smith is to be commended for encouraging the to produce such interesting work. Thank you very much. Over to you then, John, if you'd like to get started.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all of the people who have attended this evening. I hope you enjoy it. And as well as speaking about Bradford Heritage Recording Unit, it's also a trip back into the 1980s. So hope you enjoy. The Bradford Heritage Recording Unit is just one collection of a number in the Bradford Museum's photo archive, and this is its logo. Whenever people ask about photos or mention photos and Bradford, visitors often assume that we're talking about the Media Museum, or what originally was the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. This archive is nothing to do with that museum, although we have collaborated with it on a number of occasions. This is part of council-run Bradford District Museums and Galleries. So we're particularly proud that for a council-run museum service, we have such a large collection of photographs. This is the logo for Bradford District Museums and Galleries, and it consists of 4 different sites. The first is a medieval house called Bollinghall Museum. The second is Cartwright Hall, which is an art gallery, opened in 1904. The third is in a nearby town, and apologies, some of you may already be familiar with Keighley, but it's a town 7 or 8 miles away from Bradford, Keighley, and it's part of the Metropolitan District. And then finally, the one that you've just heard about is Bradford Industrial Museum, formerly a textile mill. It was opened in the early 1970s, and on its 3rd floor, it houses the photo archive. And this is the main room of the photo archive. It's the room that Gilly and her group visited a few months ago. The photo archive, now it's growing, has moved. You see the double doors at the end of the room. It's moved into the adjoining room now, but for a long time this was the headquarters of the photo archive. Interestingly, when the museum first opened in the early 1970s, this was the design room, and quite a large number of people worked in it, both designing and building displays and exhibitions for all of the museums in the museum service. As you can see, it's fairly untidy, and it's very much a working area, although we encourage tours by students and groups such as yourselves to have a look around. Our hope, I should just go back actually, you'll see above the picture of the two children playing with the railway set, there are some cardboard boxes. Originally those shelves were full of one of the particular collections that we've got in their original negatives boxes, and a continuing aim of ours is to get those put into their permanent storage. And you can see these metal drawers with 4-flap folders, so that they're stored in a much better situation. This is our website, the homepage of photos.bradfordmuseums.org, and images from all of our collections are on there. Actually, this is a recent redesign of our website, and with the budget that we had, Gilly mentioned before we started that in her work there wasn't much in the way of funding, and we are quite similar, that money is tight. So with the website, we had enough money to create a fluid and automatic homepage. But then when we went into the subsequent pages, it's a fairly standard kind of array of pictures from there. But that's our website. And in the photo archive, we've got many smaller collections, but the ones that are the most important are as follows. And really, they are the ones that you could ask me to talk to you about any of them, and I would be able to take just as long on each one, because each of them has an important story. Very briefly, Christopher Pratt, Bradfordians will know, is a furniture store, originally opened in the 1880s. And the grandson of the owner, the original Christopher Pratt, was a keen photographer working in the early 1900s. And he was called Christopher as well. He not only took photographs of his own family, but he also took many of slum dwellings in the centre of Bradford. And it's a unique picture, really, at either end of Bradford society in the early 1900s. Then we have possibly another collection that you may have heard of, the Bellevue Studio collection. Bellevue was a portrait studio which originally opened in the early 1900s, but the bit that we are most interested in and have got most material from is from the 1950s to the 1970s. And it's just at the time when many people were coming to Bradford from other parts of the world. And for reasons that I won't go into now, because as I say, this is a story in itself, the Bellevue Studio was very welcoming to all of these newcomers. And so in that collection, we have around 17,000 negatives, 10,000 of which are online. It's really difficult not to want to tell you more about each of these, but that's not what we're speaking about tonight. by far the biggest collection is that of C.H. Wood. And C.H. Wood was a commercial photographer who worked throughout the 20th century. He, as well as taking photos of the major businesses in Bradford, he was also a pioneer in aerial photography. And we have over 350,000 images taken by him. So it's that collection really that makes our overall archive so large. In 2020, we began to think that our archive was very good. We were very proud of it, but it was becoming rather historical, and it wasn't really coming into the 21st century. So come to our rescue was Carolyn Mendelsohn, a Bradford photographer, and her Through Our Lens project. As a lot of photographers found, when the pandemic struck, all of their work disappeared. And so she set up a project working with teenagers and documenting their experiences through the pandemic and lockdown. And when it ended, the work was exhibited, was very highly enjoyed, and when it had finished, the collection came into our archive, and it's special in that the photographers are all still alive, rather than the ones that I've told you up to now are no longer with us. And also it's the first born digital collection that we have. Then the sixth one is, the fifth one is the work of Ian Beasley. He is a photographer who was brought up very close to the Industrial Museum in Fagley, and he's nearing retirement and has asked that his work comes into our archive. He's had several recently successful exhibitions at Salts Mill, which is in Saltaire near to Bradford, and we're very pleased to have acquired that collection. That's an ongoing piece of work. Sorry, I've jumped a slide. And then the one that you've really come here to learn about tonight is Bradford Heritage Recording Unit. And I chose that picture to look at particularly because it highlights, in a way, the reasons why we're only just starting to concentrate on this collection more than we have done in previous years. Because when the Bradford Heritage Recording Unit ended, and in the first few years afterwards, the photographs seemed like we were contemporary. You know, we were looking at the present almost. But now that nearly 40 years has gone by, almost half a century, then they become historical records. And this one in particular is interesting because you can see the tech that this office worker is using is obviously it's from a different age. And at one point it was at the cutting edge of technology. Also, it's interesting that this picture comes from as it says at the bottom, the telephone sales section of Grattan. And I don't know how many of you remember Grattan catalogues. That was a Bradford company, and it was a very large company employing a huge number of people with a range right the way across the nation. And in a similar way that come Christmas time, people nowadays are looking on Amazon for gifts to buy people or for a whole range of things. In the 1980s and previously, people would look into the Grattan catalogue, and you could see a couple of them there on top of the monitor, and they would have in them all manner of things to be bought, and it was a kind of a mail order, hire purchase sort of thing. So I thought it would be interesting to start with that one. Bradford Heritage Recording Unit was set up in September of 1983, as it says there, by Bradford Metropolitan Council and the Manpower Services Commission. At that point, the museum service and the library service were joined together as one. Ironically, they now are again, having spent a number of years as kind of separate entities. And as you may know, the Manpower Services Commission was a job creation scheme. Although there are huge differences, the 1980s has quite a number of parallels to now. It was a time of flux, of change, of huge unemployment. You remember we had at that time the miners' strike and various other amounts of industrial action. And as a kind of a job creation scheme, the Manpower Services Commission was set up. And there were a number of projects around Bradford and all over the north of England that were happening at that time. And as it says there, the main aim was it was a kind of mass observation project, that the main aim was to capture the memories and reflections of Bradford people, looking at across ages and also different diverse communities. And at that time, with it being pre-digital, it was by means of tape recorded interviews, then moving into cassettes and photographs. And although the funding ended in 1988, some of the BHRU activities went on into the 1990s. As happens with a lot of these kinds of projects, they were started off being very well funded, and then gradually the money ran out. The original scheme was to employ, to give individual photographers a job for a year. And in that year, they would be able to, they would work on Bradford Heritage Recording Unit projects. They would be given a chance to do work on some of their own projects. And also there were various other pieces of work that had to be done. For example, at the same time, the Bellevue studio negatives were coming into the museum service, and part of their job was to clean those up as best they could, and also to create contact sheets and document them as well. So it was a range of work that was carried out. And sorry, let me just go back. Several of the BHRU staff went on to have successful careers in photography. Tim, who I notice is in on the meeting with us, is an example of that, working as a freelance photographer in Bradford ever since, and continues to do so now. And a number of others of the team continued as photographers as well. And also in the area of the oral history, a man called Rob Perks was in charge of that, and he went on to become director of oral history at the British Library. I'll say a little bit more about the oral history as we move on. It was a very complex project in many ways, and it's also quite a complex project to explain, but also to make sure that now we have all the documentation in the right place and the right order, and it's a thing that we've been working on over the last couple of years. As it says there, it includes sound recordings and transcripts and summaries of full life story interviews. This is the oral history side of it, arranged in these particular areas. It's interesting that the photography followed those subject areas as well to a large extent. And all of the interviews that we have are arranged in those sections. Some are very large, like the textile ones. There were many interviews in that, and in the second and third one, and some are very small, such as the quarrying and engineering. One thing that the recording unit did was to start actually working with the material that they created straight away. Bradford at that time had a 3-tier education system, which consisted of first schools, middle schools, and upper or secondary schools. And the boy on the right there is a student at a middle school. I know middle schools quite well because that was what I taught in the middle school sector. And they produced education packs. You can see the catalogue in front of him there, as well as books and other materials. So it was a relatively short-lived group or unit, but the work that was produced was immense. Right, let me just, sorry. Yeah. So just sticking with the oral history, I hope you'll bear with me. Just to give you an idea of what was being recorded. This first, in a moment or two, you'll think that 2 minutes is a very long time, but it is only 2 minutes. There are people in here, they're all from the textiles section. And in the first recording, there's somebody giving a pearl of wisdom about there being nothing new. Then there's a man talking about steam trams. And then finally, there's a woman talking about industrial action. The interesting thing, looking at the textile recordings, particularly now, is that a lot of those people interviewed in the 1980s were already retired. And so they could remember times going back to the start of the century almost, certainly to the 1930s and the Second World War. In fact, the man that mentions the steam train later on in the interview, he talks about remembering the opening of Cartwright Hall Art Gallery, which was in 1904. So, hope you can understand the Yorkshire dialect.
When I hear them telling stuff like that, what's happening today? I said to myself, well, that was going on 60 years ago. It didn't know fresh.
Steam tram, and there was somewhere else beside there, but where I don't know whether it was Canal Road, Bolton Road, or what have you. Steam tram.
I don't think I suggested it in the first place, but I might have been the one that asked the overlooker, told him, and he said no. He said he would see what they said, but it would have only given us about a penny. We wouldn't have had threepence at the end of the week. It was maybe a penny for the whole skep full of things, you see. We'd have had about threepence at the end of the week. I mean, it wasn't a lot. So they would all be there anyway. I mentioned, as a matter of fact, I think I mentioned it to one of the boys that used to come round doing something to the machines, and he said, I'll tell him. So he told. And he came and asked, so I said, we should, for the extra work we're putting in. So he said he would see what the bossy said, and the bossy said no a bit, and then we decided that we would walk out, you see. So we all down tools said that they wanted to see the boss, and so overlooker had no option but to send for the boss, and we told him, and he said we could either get on with it or get out. So we walked out. And we went back next day, but the manager came to me and they said, you're no longer working in here. You can go in the twisting. I said, I don't want to go in the twisting. I don't like the twisting. He says, you can take it or leave it. He said, if you don't go in the twisting, then you can't work here, you see. So I thought, well, I'll see what it's like. I had an idea and I didn't fit. No, I didn't like it. So I went home.
And then the second one is not as long as that.
Telling the boss what to do, he told you what to do. But with many a happy time, you know, it wasn't all bad.
Sorry, I didn't get the beginning of that. Just hang on.
Well, you get to work and your boss was your boss. There was no telling the boss what to do, he told you what to do. But with many a happy time, you know, it wasn't all bad. No, I didn't find so. We had lots of fun, and we, as I say, we worked hard and we played hard a bit when we jammed.
Okay, the photo on the right reminds me that in addition to the photographs that were being taken, the contemporary photographs that were being taken in the 1980s, the interviewers would ask any of the interviewees if they had any photographs, either of themselves, their families, where they worked, or any photographs really that that they felt were important to them. And so the unit would borrow them. In some cases they were donated, and they were put onto contact sheets or printed off and kept. The negatives were kept as part of the unit. These were known as deposit photographs because members of the public had deposited them. So we have a whole range of, as well as the contemporary photographs from the 1980s, we also have a large collection of these that belong to the interviewees. Okay, I was saying to Gilly earlier on that there are tens of thousands of photographs in contemporary photographs in the Bradford Heritage Recording Unit, and it would be impossible to include something about all of them. So what I've tended to do is to look at a number of themes, some of which are quite serious and some are less so. And the first one is textiles. I should mention, by the way, that I could have chosen recordings from some of the other sections, but I just happen to have those textile ones here at home, so that's why I included them. This is Lister's Mill in Manningham in Bradford, and obviously you will know that textiles was a major industry in Bradford. It was known the world over for its textiles, and we had in the middle of Bradford the Wool Exchange, where buyers from all over the world came to bid for wool and to sell wool and all of that kind of thing. And so Bradford was textiles was very important to Bradford. And Lister's Mill is, I'm not sure whether it is the biggest, but it's certainly one of the biggest. And even now, because the building is still there, it dominates the Bradford skyline from the other side of Bradford. You may or may not know Bradford itself, but it's in at the bottom of a bowl. So if you approach Bradford city centre from any direction, you have to go downhill. And so Lister's Mill is raised up on one of the hillsides. So practically anywhere, from anywhere in Bradford, you can see Lister's Mill chimney. And that's a photograph by Tim Smith from 1989. I'm looking at textiles really from two different angles, because the Heritage Recording Unit performed a very important role here, that although textiles was certainly still in operation, and to a small extent still is, it was very much in its last days, and mills were closing on a large scale at the beginning of the 1980s. At one point, when I was growing up in Bradford in the early 1960s, you could look across Bradford and you couldn't count the number of mill chimneys that there were. It really was a huge number of mills that were in operation. And these ones here, like Bingley Mills, which is spinning silk, it was becoming a little bit of a rarity by the 1980s. And it was important that this be captured before it disappeared. This is also Bingley Mills, 1989. And many of the people that were coming into Bradford from other parts of the world, the textiles was one of the areas that they came to work in. And you can see that's an example of that here. And we'll see some more later. Daniel Illingworth Mill, this is in Bradford, 1987. Daniel Illingworth, the mill had been in operation for most of the last century. In fact, we have in another collection a picture of Daniel Illingworth, the original Daniel Illingworth, looking a little bit like a tramp, because he obviously worked so long that he wasn't really interested in the fineries of life that later generations had. But by the 1980s, by this time, the mill had already been taken over by a national group. This is also in Daniel Illingworth. And what interests me about this photograph is that the technology of textiles was continuing to move on. My father, my dad worked in textiles, and he was amazed at some of this modern machinery that was coming into the mills. So you tend to get a picture of textile mills as being dirty and sort of very loud and so on, whereas this looks much more modern and streamlined. So the mills were still in operation, but there were problems. And really, since the 1950s, and even before that, post Second World War, the textile industry was a little bit a tale of boom and bust. And I remember my father, some of the time, in the boom times, he would be working overtime, and in the bust times, he'd be laid off to maybe 2 days a week or something like that. And by the time that we got into the 1980s, many mills were closing. In fact, that's part of the reason why the Bradford Industrial Museum, one of the earliest industrial museums in the country, was actually created, because people began to realise that a lot of the machines and the knowledge and all of the other parts of the textile industry were going to be lost if people didn't save some of it. So the Industrial Museum was created to document how Bradford had been a centre for the textile industry. And one of the early curators that I spoke to, I remember him saying that at one point mills were closing so fast that they were having to turn artifacts away because there were so many objects and such coming into the museum. This is a bit of a personal one for me. It's taken by a photographer called David Bocking. This is the door of the Managers and Overlookers Association. And the Managers and Overlookers was a trade union that my dad belonged to. And he was secretary for a time. And it was one of the unions that eventually got taken over by one of the larger ones that exist today. But at one point, there was a union for every different skill in the textile industry. And this was one of them. This was in a building called Textile Hall, where the Managers and Overlookers met. And just a few short years after you had all the machinery operating in the length and breadth of mill floors like this, it was empty. And many mills were closing like this. And there are vast buildings, and many of them were demolished. Thankfully, Lister's Mill remained, and it's now luxury flats, and it still dominates the Bradford skyline. But this was it in 1989, and this is another photograph by Tim Smith. And Bradford suffered as a result of the loss of the textile industry, and although a number of mills were kept, quite a large number were demolished. And this is another photo by Tim, and this is in Manningham in Bradford on a rainy day, clearly. As well as working in the textile industry, many workers came from other parts of the world to work on in transport. And this is the staff canteen, as it says there, at Bradford Bus and Rail Interchange. The interchange itself was quite a modern building, was built in the 1970s, I think. And these are some of the workers, the drivers and conductors. Much later, when the Bellevue Studio collection was digitized, we met bus conductors. This was partly organised by Tim. This was in not too long before the pandemic, and they were kind of the descendants of these bus conductors. And we took portraits from the Bellevue Studio collection to see if anybody recognised any of them. And I think it was Tim that told me that quite a number of descendants of those original portraits still worked in the interchange for Bradford buses, and were able to recognise the photographs. Just moving on, I said it was a history, a kind of a look at the history of the 1980s, and this is another thing that is no longer with us, the video shop. And yet, whether it was a place like this or Blockbusters in the 1980s, a lot of us, to get something different to watch for the weekend, would go to hire a video. And this is one, as it says there, Mr. Malik and his video shop on White Abbey Road in Bradford. There's some images that are to do with food. As you know, probably Bradford has quite a reputation as far as curry is concerned. And I think it's actually more important than that, really. It's the growing popularity of curries. That I looked at the business records of Bradford businesses for the 1960s, and there were only around half a dozen restaurants in Bradford. The idea of eating out up until probably the 1970s, it just wasn't done anywhere near as much as it is now. And the arrival of the curries, I think was a major player in that, in people going out. Now, originally, the curry shops opened, and this goes back to the 1950s, and then into the 60s, they opened to serve food to the people coming into the textile industry, kind of people coming from Asia, wanted to eat food that they recognised, and so curry houses began to open, but they weren't necessarily catering for the indigenous population. We're going to refer to fish and chips later. I'll probably put this slide in the wrong place. This is another Tim's pictures, which is outside a fish and chip shop. Fish and chips, a traditional, popular food. And this is what the indigenous population would think of as being a major centre of fish and chips. It's Harry Ramsden's fish and chip shop, which is at a place called Gilly, not too far out of Bradford. And as you probably know, it became a national institution. And funnily enough, although that is still a fish and chip shop, it isn't owned by Harry Ramsden's anymore, even though the brand still exists. Not particularly hygienic. If you see, this is inside Harry Ramsden's, you'll see that a number of the plates of fish and chips have got labels stuck into them, and not especially hygienic, but that's kind of the background of Harry Ramsden's. I'm really sorry. I've got them some of these in the wrong order, because I should have included the curry restaurants together. But this is another famous curry restaurant in Bradford. It's the Karachi, and it was very popular, visited by, as I said, originally by Asian workers. But then both this and another famous one, the Kashmir restaurant, are quite close to the university. And so a second group that started to use them was the students. And it's interesting that this 1986, you have not only Asians using these restaurants, that you'd also start to get the white population moving in to eat either after the pub closed at the weekend, or after a while it became very sort of almost middle class kind of thing to do. So families would bring their children down here on a Sunday, and why not, to eat curries. Very popular. And I think this was the one that Rick, forgotten his name, the man from Devon, the chef, visited at one point. And this is, as I mentioned earlier on, originally there were only a very few restaurants in Bradford, but really from the 1980s onwards, eating out and the idea of going for a meal came to the working classes, and it became much, much more popular than I remember it being, certainly in my childhood. And I think that is with, in the Bradford area at least, with a great thanks to the curry houses. And now people would not think anything about eating out several times a week. Whereas in those days, it was still a relatively rare thing to do. The unit obviously interviewed various people. You would possibly know that the 1980s was a time, it's not only a controversial time in the rest of the country, it was particularly so in Bradford, that you had the Bradford 12 case, and also the Ray Honeyford case, and also it was the authority where the Conservative Eric Pickles, who later became an ally of Margaret Thatcher, served in the council. And so it was a very kind of controversial, lively time, you might say. And the Heritage Recording Unit did record all of this, and in interviews and in photography as well. In fact, the interviews have an embargo on them of 30 years. So with certain ones of them, and quite wisely, the unit, for each one that was a bit controversial, they put a red sticker on all of the pieces of material to do with that interview. And now we've kind of still adopting the same policy, because it seems it seemed to us that 30 years doesn't seem quite as long ago as it used to do. And so apart from researchers, we are still sticking to the point that if any interview is deemed to be controversial, then we won't allow people to listen to it. But anyway, sorry, I digress. This is Ernest Saville, Labour councillor and also an ex-mayor, and he's in his home. And this now is not only a record of him, but it's a kind of a record of a typical interior in the 1980s. And anybody looking at this picture now would be able to spot various things that have changed radically since then, such as the TV set, the gas fire, and also the styles within the photograph. You might notice that quite a number of the photographers are male, and there was a female photographer, Susan Hackett here, who Tim was telling me not too long ago actually wasn't originally employed as a photographer, but very quickly became one, and went on to have a successful career in photography. I wanted to get over the idea that the recording unit photographed not only important events like weddings and important parts of people's lives, it also sought to look into what people might think of as being trivial. And that slide that I showed you earlier on was very true, that it looked at people's leisure as well as at the things that were landmark occasions in their lives. And I've got two pictures here of allotments. And I was saying earlier on that Bradford is in a bowl. The centre of Bradford is like at the bottom of a valley. And if you look through the windows, you can see that he's up on a hillside, and you've got Bradford Centre down below. So it's taken by a photographer called Paul Robinson, who over the years I've tried to find, but he's unfortunately, we don't know anything more about him. And as it says there, again by Paul Robinson from 1987, these are two Italian sisters picking peas on their allotments. I think the last few slides, there are a number still to go. Oh, crikey, it's almost 7 o'clock, isn't it? Sorry, if I'm going on too long, just say. This is a group of, as it says there, a group of Bangladeshi children in Manningham, and this is again taken by. This is very close to Bradford City Football Club. It's quite ironic in the way that they're playing table football, and they're so close to the ground. And the notes for this photograph and other associated ones talk about the racism that this community had to suffer every Saturday as football supporters went to the ground. However, as you will know, in 1985, we had the tragic Bradford fire. And it is said in the days before mobile phones that many Bangladeshi households opened their doors to allow people to use telephones to telephone loved ones, and also provided food and shelter and help and so on. This is by a photographer called David Bocking, and Bradford has always been a place of shelter and has always welcomed people from other parts of the world into the community. And it continues now until this time Vietnamese children, and that's at a first school. This is one of my favourite ones of taken by Tim, and you can see the caption there. I think it's just the expression on the girl's face, on the girl on the left face, and yes. Also, the unit covered various different religions and religious events, religious festivals. And it wasn't only people from Asia and from the Caribbean. Bradford has also welcomed people from Eastern Europe, and in the case of Ukraine, continues to do so now. And that photograph was taken by Gary Clarkson. The Dominican Association, during the Bradford Festival, began in the 1980s, and it grew to what became known as the Mailer, and the recording unit documented events such as this throughout. Bradford street scene. It was in some cases when I was going through, because I planned this last week, And when I was going through it again yesterday, I sort of thought, why have I included that photograph? And I'm not sure now. It doesn't really tie in with any others, but it's just rather dramatic. And we had snow here in Bradford not too long ago, and there we are. And in the same way that I began with a picture of a mill worker, this is another mill worker who is working at Salt's Mill, because when the mill at Saltaire originally closed as a textile mill, and it's a vast building, many smaller businesses moved in, some of them still operating today, and this is one of them, a horologist called Steve Bean. And that's the end. Now, we've got around 20,000 pictures online on our website, and I no longer work there, but if you wanted to inquire about any of them or have more information about any, then you can go on the site. But also there is an email address which Gilly, I'm sure, will pass on to you for the archive. And that's it. I've finished.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. And having been a youngster in the 1980s, some of those pictures brought back some memories I thought were long buried deep in my brain. So thank you for doing that for me. We've got some questions and some really nice comments, which we will share with you after the event. But just to pick up very briefly, just in the last couple of minutes, some questions. First one is how is the archive being used today? You know, what's it being used for?
That's a good question. Researchers is one element. I mean, it's difficult for me to say in a sense because I don't do it anymore. But we've worked with a number of student organisations to students have visited the archive, have learned more about it, and then have gone off into the centre of Bradford to produce work of their own, kind of based on it. The researchers have been, and this is part of the reason why we've worked particularly on this unit in recent years. I should have mentioned when I was talking about the interviews that they've all been digitized now, so researchers can listen to them without visiting us. That they're all online, and we thought that it would be important to make sure that all of the documentation, if any of those researchers visited us, was neatly presented and was all in one place. Because, to be honest, as I said right at the beginning, we spent a number of years not really working on it at all because it was deemed to be contemporary and so on. But I'm told that kind of study of oral history has become very important for researchers. And so we made the decision that we would spend some time bringing together all of the different records. So as I said earlier, we for the more interesting interviews, they have green stickers. They transcripts were produced, and for each of them as well, there was a summary of the interview, and also there was a permissions sheet, like a consent sheet. And in the work that we've been doing, we've made sure that all of those are together, so that people will get a complete record when they visit. And we've had a couple of university researchers come to visit to not only hear the interviews, but to look at some of the photographs as well. It fits very well, I should have mentioned earlier, chronologically with the other collections, that you have right at the start, you've got the Christopher Pratt pictures, which show Bradford at the start of the 20th century. And then C.H. Wood really runs from the 1930s right the way through to the year 2000 when the company closed. And it also shows Bradford industry when it was in full flow. And so all of the mills that Tim and the unit took photographs of when they'd finished working, we've got pictures of them when they were working at their finest, if you like. And that's the C.H. Wood collection. And then the Bradford Heritage Recording Unit, kind of Autumn Andy and Beasley, moves then into the post-industrial era. And then you've got the younger people's work showing the pandemic and so on, which brings it up to the present day. We also have the school students as well, but it is something that we are. It's not we, because it's not me anymore. But the archive, and my successor, who is called Olivia, that she will be working on to bring more people into the archive to work with it. And of course, the digitisation continues as well.
Yep. That's great, John. Thank you. In fact, you preempted a couple of the questions. It's nice to see, actually, we've got Tim Smith online and Deb Bedford, who also worked with the archive, and also Rob Perks from the British Library Oral History. So Rob's online as well. So you've had a good audience tonight.
Well, I hope I've not done them any kind of disservice.
I'm sure you haven't.
I hope they've not spent the hour saying, no, it wasn't like that. That did not.
But certainly Tim's pictures are absolutely wonderful, and I think we'd all love to see more of those in due course. In fact, someone's made the comments that someone should actually interview yourself, John, because it's clear that you've got a very deep knowledge of the archive. And I think probably just one final question just to end, as we're sort of slightly out of time now, is, are you aware that the archive's doing anything for the City of Culture in 2025? Because it seems like there's a fantastic resource there that could really benefit from some exposure during that year.
I think so, certainly.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm not a party to exactly what is happening, but certainly, you remember me mentioning Carolyn Mendelssohn, who is she is one of your. I forget what the term is.
She's one of our ambassadors, and we know Carolyn very well. She's a wonderful photographer. Yeah,
well, she is doing a piece of work which is based on the Bellevue Studio collection, which is not in any way trying to recreate the studio. She spent a couple of days in the archive looking at the Bellevue Studio portraits in order to inform her own work, which is kind of bringing it into the 21st century. Right. And I know Tim, in what he was saying yesterday to me, he's doing some work as well, which may or may not include the archive. Okay, I'm just going to bring things to a close, but I'm going to just read out Rob's comments, who firstly says, thanks you for a really excellent presentation, and then just says that he's feeling quite emotional about all that we seem to have achieved all those years ago. So I think that's probably the best vote of confidence in what you've achieved and what the archive has done. So I'd just like to bring the evening to a conclusion by firstly thanking Gilly Reid for arranging this evening, and John, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and deep insights to the archive, and of course to people like Tim and Deb and Rob, who have made the archive what it's grown, enhanced through time, and is clearly now such an important resource for Bradford. And I think we're all itching now to go and look at the website to see some more of those wonderful images. So thank you to the audience for staying with us this evening, and thank you again, John and Gilly, for your arranging this evening and for your insights, John. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you very much, John. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm very glad I arranged it. I thought it would be a good do, and it was. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, then.